Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Susan Douglas, who's here to discuss her book, The Mommy Myth, The Idealization of Motherhood, and How It's Undermined Women. Welcome to Rip Rap, Susan.
Well, thanks for having me.
And we should point out right away that this is your second appearance on Rip Rap, since we also discussed your earlier book, which had an even longer title, Listening In, Radio and the American Imagination from Amos and Andy and Edward R. Murrow. I think I can do all this. To Wolfman Jack and Howard Stern. Yeah, and that book, of course, dealt with the way commercial radio emerged. But it was fun. Now with this book, The Mommy Myth, I was wondering how and why you and your co-author Meredith W. Michaels decided to work on it.
Well, when I had a child, I did not get a sleeper. I got one that didn't sleep. And so she decided about the age of 5 months that she would get up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. and she was up for the day. So, you know, at 8, 7:30 in the morning, I would go into the supermarket. And unlike Sarah Jessica Parker, I did not weigh less, you know, after having my child than I did before. So I would go in, you know, wearing my husband's sweatpants, which were the only thing that fit, and some sweater that had, you know, baby spit up all over it and hair that was, you know, akimbo. And we'd go to the checkout line, and I'd have a screaming baby there, and I was exhausted. And there would be the bleachers of magazines with celebrity moms on the cover. And they were saying things like, motherhood is sexy. You know, the last thing I felt was sexy. And you would go inside and read about all of the things that they were doing to ensure that their children would be Nobel laureates by the time they were 12. And their houses were decorated in white. You know, they had toddlers, and they had white shag rugs and white sofas. But more importantly, I think more perniciously, these profiles told you how you were supposed to feel. And how you were supposed to feel was ecstatic and blissed out 24/7 as a mother. And that is not the reality of most mothers' lives. And so just being confronted with a media landscape that didn't include me and had nothing to do with my life made me think there was a real gap between the image of motherhood and the reality of how mothers live their lives.
In fact, that's where the book starts, is in the line at the supermarket, you know, with a couple of the kids whining and crying and carrying on, and the teenager in the car in kind of a state of revolt. It is quite daunting.
Well, you know, to add a little bit to this celebrity mom profile kind of assault that many of us began feeling in the late 80s and early 90s, I had my child in 88. In the late 70s, I did an analysis of the covers of women's magazines from 75 to 2000, just to see, like, you know, was this celebrity mom profile in the Miracle Baby something new, or had it always been there? Turns out that that kind of profile did not exist in the late 70s and early 80s. You know, there might be one celebrity, you know, mom on the cover in an entire year of all of the 4, you know, major women's magazines, McCall's, Good Housekeeping, Red Book, Ladies' Home Journal. You know, it'd be somebody like Princess Grace, right? 1981 was the turning point when Debbie Boone was on there with her baby, and the headline was, "He lights up my life." Right, which were lyrics to her Grammy award-winning song, but now, of course, wittily referred to her child. And by the late 80s, early 90s, celebrity mom covers with, you know, their miracle babies on the covers, and by the way, the kids were just as beautifully made up as the moms, right, dominated between 1/5 and 1/4 of the covers of women's magazines. So for those of us who had children in that period, the sense of assault was right. There had been a big change, and these idealized images of motherhood coming through celebrity mom profiles were indeed everywhere.
Well, and one of the things you do throughout the book is keep putting this into the context of that media history for these 30 years of what's been happening. And you have people like Dr. Spock. There's some pointed comments about Dr. Spock and that kind of comment about how they're setting up unrealistic expectations and how they're, you know, what the moms are supposed to be able to do.
Well, you know, I think that motherhood seems like just some fixed state, that we forget that motherhood has a history and that we share that history. Mothers who have very different, class experiences, racial experiences, different marital relations, we all share a history of kind of tromping through this media environment and having this media environment, tromp on us collectively. And so it was important to remind mothers in the book that this history has changed and that there have been fads and fashions in child rearing and in motherhood. And I think that, when I had a baby, it was my first baby, what did I know, So of course I went to advice columns. So it seemed to me very important to go back and look at advice columns and see what they had been telling mothers over time, and, to look at actually how dumb, and self-serving some of the advice was. So it's true, we did have some fun with Dr. Spock and Lee Salk and some of these other, celebrity kid shrinks from the 70s and 80s, because at the core of their message was a real undermining of the common sense that most mothers have about raising their kids. I mean, are there things we don't know and need advice about? Sure. But the thrust of these was to undermine common sense, and I actually think, we need to trust our common sense a lot more.
Well, it started setting up this conflict of the mommy wars between the mothers that stay at home and the mothers who work, and there was quite a debate back and forth about that perhaps just wasn't necessary to do it that way.
Well, what's interesting again about doing a history is you see when things like the mommy wars emerged. If you looked at women's magazines in the 70s, including relatively conservative ones like the Ladies' Home Journal, they realized that they had a very divided audience. They had stay-at-home mothers, but they also had recently divorced women, widowed women, single women who had to work. And they really sought to address both of these audiences. And a lot of these magazines in this period in the 70s try to operate as kind of switchboards between mothers. How would Mother X give Mother Y advice? Well, how are we all in it together, whether we work outside the home or not? Now, by the 90s, you get the so-called mommy wars. Now, we know that in journalism, conflict sells. It's a great way to, get magazines to, jump off the stands. So we began to see the mommy wars with stay-at-home mothers pitted against working mothers. Now, are there sometimes tensions between stay-at-home mothers and working mothers? Of course. But I think this has been an incredibly exaggerated war. I'm a working mother. A lot of the mothers I know are stay-at-home mothers or they work part-time. We cooperate all the time. We schlep each other's kids around. We look after each other's children. We care about the same things. And so I think that this mommy wars business, it can get people to watch Dr. Phil when he pits, stay-at-home mothers against working mothers, and it can elevate your temperature. But it can also exacerbate a phony war that often doesn't exist.
Well, I think you put your finger on it. It's also in the book about the media's needs were the ones that had to, construct this as a conflict situation, and so then there was all this churning out of all this stuff. And throughout the book, there's there's kind of a subtext or quite a distinct text about talking about what the media needs and how it can what's going on, and of course it always trying to position itself in being terribly helpful, that those advice columns are really important.
Well, this is one of the few books that has really looked at the role of the media over the past 30 years, and that is what distinguishes it from many of the other books that have come out about motherhood, and there have been many good ones, don't get me wrong, just that the focus of this was to think about how have the media shaped our perceptions of ourselves, of what is a good mother, of how should mothers, behave. And so we did look at things like the news media, for example. And, most people, if they were sitting down to write a book about motherhood, they wouldn't necessarily think about the news, right? Because you think about the news, political events, international affairs. But motherhood became a huge news story in the 1980s and beyond, precisely because the family was in flux. There were enormous changes in family structure in the 1970s and beyond. And so those changes became newsworthy. Now, having said that, because the news media rely on and came to rely increasingly on sensationalism in the 80s and beyond, we got endangered child stories, designed to lure you in because, of course, you were terrified, about what could happen to my kid next. So we began to get in the early and mid 80s stories, for example, about daycare centers allegedly staffed by pedophiles and Satanists. There were lots and lots of stories about missing children in which the figures were highly exaggerated, and kidnapped kids and so on and so forth. And so, if you were a mother watching the news in between, getting dinner ready and all the rest, you'd be really scared. You would think that your kid was in constant danger. And in fact, I'm a mother. I was subject to that too, having my child in utterly safe environments and still worrying. So I think the media have played a multifaceted role in shaping a real kind of contradictory mix of fear and apprehension and guilt on the one hand, and having that nonetheless married to an image of, but mothers should be joyful and spontaneous and carefree and always ready to do somersaults with their kids in the park. And these two ways of viewing the world don't necessarily, coexist easily.
I think the other thing is that during this time with people like Ronald Reagan, motherhood and family values got politicized. I mean, it was brought front and center into people's everyday life as a guideline, as a standard, a way to resolve all the problems. And that set up some really very difficult situations.
Yeah, well, family values, AKA patriarchy, was a way to put women in their place through motherhood. The women's movement had a very revolutionary view of the family that was a much more egalitarian view of the family. And part of it was predicated, in fact, on demanding but encouraging fathers to become much more involved with their kids. And I think one of the legacies of that is that many fathers are doing things with their children that their fathers never did, and they like it. They like being more connected to their kids. But nonetheless, this was a very revolutionary movement. So you don't have a revolutionary movement without a backlash. And that backlash began under Reaganism in the 1980s. And there was a concerted kind of, cluster of initiatives against women and families that, under the brilliant art of the rhetoric of inversion, got the name family values when most of these programs were deeply hostile to families, especially to women and kids.
I was fascinated with the way you and Meredith so thoroughly explored the way the media had been and are the dispenser of the ideals and norms, like we were talking about with motherhood, and the sheer increase in output and target marketing have bombarded mothers. I mean, I don't remember this being quite to this extent, with products, with styles, with practices, with implied, all kinds of implications about how you're supposed to, perform this role of motherhood.
Well, motherhood has been idealized throughout the 20th and now the 21st century, so, I don't mean to suggest that there weren't idealized images of motherhood in the 1920s or 30s. There were. But having said that, mothers were, in the 1980s, along with a lot of other groups, broken up into demographic niches. These escalating demands around motherhood coincided with target marketing and niche marketing. And mothers were divided up into different kinds of mothers, each of which, had a whole host of products that could be targeted to them. And kids were divided up into ever narrower demographic niches. I mean, when you and I were kids, here's a hula hoop, here's a silly putty, here's the coonskin cap, go out and play, end of story. Now, the kids are divided up into demographic niches of like 0 to 3 months, 3 months to 6 months, so on and so forth, each of which is accompanied by a bleacher load of products that is designed to be in tune with the exact developmental stage of the child. And if you don't buy those products for your kid at that developmental stage, your kid is going to be left in the dust, never get into Stanford, Harvard, or the U of M, unless they've, their mothers have bought these things. So we began to see increasingly sophisticated market research into children in the 1980s, an explosion in educational toys. Now, I'm all for educational toys. I think my basement's, filled with half of them, But there was a real reason that mothers were kind of a sucker for these toys. We feared that the institutions that your mother and my mother were able to rely on, good public schools, decent health care, etc., those were gone or, deeply eroded. And meanwhile, the institutions we did need to support the family, after-school programs, daycare, etc., were not, enacted. And so many mothers did feel that they personally had to step in and supplement where the government and corporations had left off, and the toy folks knew this. So, what we have is our kids are bombarded all the time with ads for toys and clothes and services. We're bombarded with the things we're supposed to buy for them. Then our kids come to us with the messages they've been bombarded by. And many parents, it's not just mothers, many parents feel completely under siege by this kind of marketing assault on our kids.
Well, and I thought that was something that was interesting in your book. There's a bit of an edge to it where it's saying, wait a minute, and it's also the realization this is more than just media as information. This is very intrusive, really. And you talk about the agenda setting that goes on. And so this has socioeconomic, underpinnings to this whole thing, where it's now there's a whole reason of being for, getting into people's lives and selling them product and shaping motherhoods, because you have to have women acting in a certain way to be buying the products and, for themselves, for the kids, bringing their kids up to be good little consumers that are going to be buying those products also. And the thing that really bothered me most was the welfare mother syndrome that started emerging, which is the destructive side of this.
Well, to get back to your earlier point, there's a lot of money in making mothers feel guilty. There's a lot of profits to be made there. And to be made feel guilty about everything from educational toys to are they putting organic diapers on their babies, to are they putting, pure products on their baby's skin. And you're very right, there's a huge divide between that market of mothers who, can afford those kinds of things, and how the media represented welfare mothers. And I think one of the most pernicious stereotypes that I encountered in doing this research was that African American mothers are automatically bad mothers. And that stereotype didn't come from women's magazines, because they didn't feature welfare mothers. You would never see on the cover of Red Book, right, a portrait of a welfare mother. It'd be kind of
interesting, actually, to see that once in a while.
Yeah, how I make it on $20 a day, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't see that. They were in news stories. And this is where your point earlier about agenda setting comes in. The news media respond to political elites and the kind of agenda that political elites lay out. And first the Republicans in the 1980s, and then Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, set their sights on welfare mothers, and they were going to end welfare, as Clinton put it, end welfare as we know it. And so once political elites set their sights on a particular issue, the news media follow. That's what they do, because they get a lot of their cues from, Congress people, senators, presidential candidates, presidents, etc. We began to see, beginning in the late 1980s and early 90s, increased coverage about welfare mothers that was very, very negative, that cast them as irresponsible, as neglectful, as not caring about their kids, and so on and so forth. Now, are there welfare mothers who are neglectful and don't care about their kids? Sure. Are there also celebrities in Hollywood who are neglectful and don't care about their kids? Yeah, there are. And so, this kind of coverage was really blaming the victim. It wasn't looking at, for example, women in rural areas, no public transportation, they can't get to work, no daycare for miles and miles around, and more to the point, no jobs, So there was a demonization of welfare mothers, and what I felt was going on here, because this was at the same time that celebrity moms were everywhere, right? And notice my language, welfare mothers, celebrity moms, right? Moms is more user-friendly, right? Is that the welfare mothers, I think, helped make working mothers feel better, because the way the media demonized them, which was, a very stereotypical demonization, nonetheless allowed a non-welfare mother to say, oh, well, I may have given my kid peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for last night because that's all I had, or, ordered pizza yet again, but at least I didn't do that. And so I think all mothers have to think about what happens when one group of us is demonized at the expense of the other, because at the end of the day, we all care about the same thing, the welfare of our children.
See, that's where I think the most pernicious part of media is saying, let us do your thinking for you. We'll tell you how to feel, how to react, what to do, what goals to set for yourself. Whereas if people set their own goals, do their own thinking, decide for themselves what's going to happen, then you avoid those stereotypes. That was the thing that was most upsetting to me, and I thought you really nailed it in the book about not all welfare mothers are African American. Not all welfare mothers are fat or lazy, or any of those kind of stereotypes, derogatory kinds of stereotypes that you see over and over again in news reports, even in congressional discussions, all those welfare mothers. And they're often people who are teenagers who are trying to make it.
Well, we really wanted to have a reality check here. More welfare mothers are white than African American.
That's what I thought was telling. It was really a very small minority.
Now, having said that, are a greater percentage of African Americans on welfare than whites on welfare? Yeah. But guess why? Welfare is for poor people, so we have more poor African Americans than we do white people. The 80% of welfare families consisted of a mother and 2 kids or less. But what did the media focus on? The, multi-generational, grandmother, mother, daughter on welfare, each, married, unmarried, but having kids by 5 different men, because those are sensational. Those get your blood boiling. They're unusual. That's what the news media focuses on. That's what's news. What is news? What's unusual? So through these kinds of stories, a stereotype was perpetrated that most welfare mothers had 3, 4, 5 kids by different men, that they were irresponsible, that their grandmothers had been on welfare, and so had they. This was a tiny, and I mean tiny, fraction of welfare recipients. And, my concern about this today in 2004 is with quote-unquote welfare reform. A lot of these families have been starting to get cut off since 2002, and I don't know what's going to happen to them. The mothers are on workfare. They're working between work and commuting. They're away from home 12 hours a day. It's not a humane way to allow poor people to raise their children. I think one of the agenda-setting functions that came into play here with welfare mothers and with crack babies, which, as you know from the book, was a complete myth. There's no such thing as a crack baby, was that we were urged to think that welfare mothers were sucking the economy dry, that they were producing an entire underclass of kids who would never be responsible again, and so on and so forth.
Before we end, I do want to talk about, I'm always fascinated by the communities of people that support different projects, and you give a full acknowledgement, both you and Meredith, at the end of the book.
Well, I came to the University of Michigan in 1996, and You know, I am a shameless fan and promoter of the university because they worked so hard to help me finish actually 2 books since I've been here. And but the other thing about the university that I admire so much is when I came here, I was a bit daunted by how many really quite eminent, well-known people were here. And, you know, might I get to meet them, and, you know, what would they be like? At many other places, the diva level can be kind of high. And here it's not. I just met person after person on the faculty who was incredibly generous intellectually and willing to talk and read work. And there's a great community here, and I think people do need to understand that, you know, while there might be 1 or 2 authors' names on a book, you know, the kind of support it takes to make that happen, as any writer will attest, comes from your family, you know, your partner, your spouse, understanding children, colleagues, institutional support. So I just feel incredibly blessed that I've been at such a great place and with such great colleagues, and also, you know, I have a terrific husband who's, you know, shared a lot with me and, you know, enabled this to happen.
You also had mentioned the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and people like Sonia Rose and Carol Smith Rosenberg. And I really enjoy that, because I think that's something that's important for young scholars to remember also, that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is really a community project. Absolutely. Well, there never seems to be enough time because there's so much to discuss. But I did want to, your Chapter 8 takes an aim at other logical elements like men. And I think that is part of it, that it's so easy when you're talking about mothering to leave other elements out of it. And you talk about the chapter's titles, Dumb Men, Stupid Choices, or Why We Have No Child Care. Maybe you talk a little bit about that.
There was a book out in the 70s or 80s called, you know, Smart Women, Stupid Choices. So the chapter title is a play on that. And the book doesn't do that much with fatherhood. That could have been a whole other book on the kind of evolution and history of fatherhood. And the book does not mean to bash fathers. You know, fathers aren't doing as much housework and childcare as they should, but they're doing a lot more childcare than they used to. But this particular chapter is about how our primarily male political leaders have really let mothers down.
Women set their own agenda.
I hope so.
Yeah. Great book, and I'm glad you're on Rip Rap again, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Well, thanks very much. It was great to be here.